That feeling when you have 9 people for the draft.
Spock!
Draft.
Out of danger? Yes. Don't grieve, Admiral. It is logical. The needs of the many outweigh
the needs of the few.
or the one.
Allow me to welcome you to this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. I am Andy, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony, Undefeated Streak Maddox?
Sure, everybody gets lucky sometimes. Sometimes you get lucky 3 times in a row.
I thought it was, so it's been 3 separate Cube drafts.
So I played a lot of Magic this week. We did a Chaos draft on Sunday where I 3-0'd, and then we played some games on stream where just by the skin of my teeth, I managed to beat you there at the end.
You beat me pretty handily, let's be clear.
Yeah, it felt mixed. And then we did another draft, our regular Tuesday night draft, and technically I drew one of the matches, so I think undefeated is a fair term.
Yeah, you didn't get defeated.
Perfect. Yeah, it is fun to win a Magic the Gathering sometimes, even though I don't do it all that often.
I think you do it pretty often.
It's hard to see that sometimes.
It is hard to see that. It is very true. It's much easier to remember your losses than your wins.
It's true.
And that game that you beat me, I think you beat me very handily. It just took an hour.
It took a long time. And also, there were a lot of mistakes along the way that made it feel worse, and definitely like a lack of understanding of the options that I had in my own deck presented some challenges. So there was still a lot of obvious room for improvement, which made it feel not like a clean, easy win. Didn't feel like a controlled situation.
Now, I definitely don't ever play matches of Magic where I get to the end and think I didn't make any mistakes. That never happens.
I've made really obvious mistakes.
Yeah, I
Very
did too.
bad
I also
ones.
made a really bad punt. I wonder.
And those are those on YouTube?
They are now, yes.
Great.
As of 2 hours ago, yeah.
On YouTube.
Yeah, if you want to see my huge punt where I didn't think literally one turn ahead and was just like, I get to swing with a 3/4 Flying Vigilance Lifelink. That's great. Turns out it's not great. Shouldn't have done that thing. It was bad. Anthony, this is a special episode of the show. We are not alone. We are joined by a member of our local playgroup who is here to talk about his set cube, the cube, in fact, we drafted on stream this past Monday, and the games of which you can find on YouTube. We are joined by Aaron Podmartyr. I actually don't know your last name, but it's fine. We're not going to dox you on the show. But you're the Podmartyr is who you are.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
You're the most generous member of our playgroup, I would say. And if we're down at the LGS and there's 9 people for a draft, you are the first person to volunteer to sit out. So much so that I've started to bully you and say, Aaron, you can't always volunteer because you have to make one of these other scrubs that's not going to volunteer sit out every once in a while.
Do you like playing Cube, I guess is the question.
Well, I don't know if you noticed, but I did take your advice to heart, and this past Tuesday I really put my foot down.
You did.
To run
It was
Magic
true.
Cube.
I was so proud of you. So proud that I bullied you into behaving how I wanted you to behave.
I'm just happy to play. So when we're not doing the draft, I usually just do a battle box or something with another person who's there. So however it happens.
Well, the playgroup is lucky to have you because it makes things run that much smoother. And it's also like to have one person that always sits out, you can make the argument more strongly that someone else should do it, right? Like if we are at 9 and you haven't played for a week or something, I can be like, Aaron sat out last week and he did it graciously. So somebody else should graciously sit out,
Mm-hmm. It just makes me feel like we're at the airport and it's like somebody better check their bags at the gate because somebody's going to have to do it.
We just slowly start increasing that we'll give you 500 miles, 1,000 miles. We'll give you 2,000 cube miles if you sit out this
They don't
this
give
cube
you.
draft.
They don't do that anymore. I don't know when the last time you've flown, but none of that stuff.
I feel like they still do that eventually. That's not for bags, though. It's when they've literally oversold the flight.
Sure, yeah, right. That's a different situation.
Yeah. I almost took one of those once. It was I was flying back from Chicago or something, and it was like, we're offering $200 for someone to skip the flight. And now $400, and now $500. And I was like, I could take $500 and a hotel stay overnight to fly back tomorrow morning.
That system just feels... We're going way off topic, but that system feels so easy to abuse. You just got to look around, make eye contact with everybody else in the terminal. It's just like, we are not going to budge. We are going to...
It's like the prison.
How high will they go?
It's some sort of weird prisoner's dilemma
Yeah.
almost. It's like you have to all agree in game theory wise, you're just going to not budge until
Somebody budges, I guess.
Until the airport is punished for their greedy capitalism. Let's just dive right in and talk about Aaron's cube. We're talking about set cubes on this episode, something that we have not talked about before in the show. We get a lot of requests to talk about set cubes. Transparently, Anthony and I have not been willing to because we have not made a set cube before, and we're not on this show to start blowing a bunch of smoke about things we don't know about. So we're really lucky to be joined by Aaron, who just finished a couple weeks ago getting your set cube built in paper, would you say?
Yeah, I finished it maybe 3 weeks ago, and then we've had 2 drafts of it since then. Should I give a little introduction to the cube itself, or start with why I picked a set cube more generally, what that is?
Let's just describe what a set cube is for people that don't know. And I think it's actually quite a range of things people call set cubes. Broadly speaking, it's a cube that is directly inspired by a specific limited set. So you really liked playing, in your case, Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, and the idea is let's just build a cube that plays more or less like Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, right?
Yeah, pretty much. So I think, we have talked about this a little bit, but set cubes strike me as maybe one of the best ways to get started with cube, where if you've never designed a cube and you're looking for an entry point. That's not an idea that's original to me. There's a lot of, set cube. Well, what set cube content exists alludes to this. But I think, designing a cube can feel pretty overwhelming. Like I know when I was putting together my first cube, which is kind of, I call my main cube, I was wondering, just where to start. And so I think having that some restrictions can mitigate that decision paralysis. And I do love that classic Mark Rosewater quote, restrictions breed creativity. And I think that shows through when designing a set cube.
Yeah, I think it's so much easier to make changes and make decisions about a cube once you already have some play experience and you're actually doing the cube thing rather than just thinking very abstractly. So even if your goal isn't to necessarily replicate a particular set exactly, I think it's just such a great way to say, like, let's leverage this resource of the fact that Wizards has designed this collection of cards to play well together, use that as sort of the nucleation site for a cube and build from there. And I think that's more or less what you've done, which is really cool to see and see already it start to evolve and change a little bit from that baseline set. But I think it is important just to talk about sort of the spectrum of what set cubes are, because I think it really is a spectrum. On one extreme, there are just the really rigorous, we're going to design a cube that is going to try and emulate a particular draft format as well as possible. So the idea is you're going to get a bunch of redundant copies of all the commons, slightly fewer number of the uncommons, a couple rares and mythics, or maybe one copy of each rare or mythic. And then if you want to go really far, even collate every single pack and like shuffle up all the commons and uncommons and rares separately, and then build packs to really try and replicate that experience exactly, which I think if you love a format, that works great because you really can get pretty close and faithful to that experience. But you can also do a lot of things that are less extreme than that, don't necessarily need to maintain that ratio exactly of the commons and uncommons. If there are particular rares you don't enjoy playing with, or if you don't actually want to collate packs, you can just take a bunch of cards from the set, maybe still have some disparity between the number of commons and uncommons, but still just shuffle it up. And sure, you'll have some packs that have a couple extra rares, which isn't exactly how a normal draft works, but it's still going to be a fun experience.
Sometimes it does. Maybe it's got a foil rare.
You can have foils. Thanks for keeping us precise. But yeah, so I think that there's anything that's possible within that range, and we could even go to the sort of more out there end where it's just like it's kind of just loosely inspired by a set or a plane or something like that, and really make it whatever you want.
The spectrum I had in my head was actually a little different. I think yours makes a lot of sense, where it's like how closely you're hewing to the actual experience of drafting that set. But another way to think about it is just how much work you put into it. And I'm interested to hear Aaron's perspective, because I know that this basically just started as like you did a single draft and you were like, that was fun. And I think a great message to people out there that are listening is like, you can take those exact cards, put them all in the same sleeves, add some basic lands, and you got a cube, baby. That's a cube.
Yeah, so you're exactly right. We did a draft of a box of Neon Dynasty, and I was like, this is great. Other people were like, this is great. And at first, that was exactly my idea. I was just like, I'm going to just sleeve up these cards, keep them in the box, and we'll just pull it out anytime we want to do a retail draft. And then, of course, I went down the rabbit hole of research and decided to make some changes. When I was putting it together, I think the spectrum that I was imagining aligned more with Anthony's, which was once I was like, okay, I'm going to start making some changes. How closely do I want to stick to replicating that retail draft versus just the essence of what I liked about it? When I was doing some research on how to put the cube together, some common guidelines I found for if you wanted to adhere more to the precise replication end of the spectrum were the kind of 3-to-1 ratio of 3 commons, 2 uncommons, 1 rare or mythic. I was reading that the retail limited ratio is actually a 6-3-1, And that adds up to a lot of cards. So
It
as
really
I
does,
was,
yeah.
yeah, and so even with, I decided to, take out some cards altogether, so I wasn't going to have some copies. But even still, I was adding up, and I was like, this is a lot. So basically, I tried to do my research about what were the recommended rules for creating a set cube that precisely mimicked or closely resembled the retail draft, and then broke some of those restrictions, which I'm happy to get into as well.
Yeah, so let's just hear more about your story with this cube, because I think starting from a regular just booster draft is like the easiest way I could think of for someone to build a cube, right?
It already even comes in a box.
Right.
It's like ready to go.
It's even easier than like going and ordering some starter cube online, which is like more work, and it's a set you like, and especially if you had like one draft where everyone had a good time. Maybe no one opened a totally oppressive bomb. Now you don't have a totally oppressive bomb in your cube, right? The cards that were opened are the ones that are going to get played. That's like the most easy way to have a cube. And we were always stressing on this show that I think if someone's interested in cube, the biggest challenge is just getting them over that hurdle of like having a cube at all, because it does feel very intimidating to design a cube, quote unquote. But people can just sleeve up the cards they have and then draft them. It's going to be fun. And then make changes as you go. Decide, I don't like this card actually. I found another card I like more. And boom, now you're cube designing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that particular feature you're mentioning does come up even for people that are trying to replicate formats pretty closely. They'll say, well, this rare is really just sort of designed for a particular constructed format and got planted in this set as a rare, or doesn't really function here in the kind of limited environment.
Hedron alignment.
Sure, so maybe you would just choose to not include the hedron alignments in your set cube, just to make it play even better. Like, obviously, when they are designing retail limited sets, they have a lot of other purposes for those packs in mind. You get to sort of say, like, well, this is the version that's tailored just for drafting and also just for the draft that my players are going to enjoy.
Anyway, we asked you a question, Aaron, then we talked for like 2 minutes. So just talk more about how this cube came to be and your journey with it.
Yeah, definitely. So the first thing that I thought about were what were the Wizards of the Coast intended archetypes from the limited draft, and which ones, when we actually drafted, which ones did I feel like worked and the players enjoyed, and which ones really didn't. The obvious example for Neon Dynasty was the red-white attacking alone with Samurai's theme. Others were just kind of nebulous. Like we had the moment where we pulled out the little draft guide card and we realized that white-black was intended to be the balance theme.
Right. Yeah. Having an artifact and an enchantment is the like black-white archetype essentially in Neon Dynasty.
From there, I was thinking about do I want to limit this cube to just this set or the plane of Kamigawa? I think another part of the consideration is balancing the technical aspect of the draft with what kind of flavor do you want to evoke with the set cube. As you alluded to, Andy, I was trying to keep an eye out for just specific cards that were real bombs, really unfun to play against, or just real duds and unfun to play for the other reason. Mana fixing, obviously, in a retail limited set is usually at a much lower density than we're accustomed to, at least in our own environment. So that was another thing I was considering tweaking. And then finally, also the cards that are intended for other formats. Although, we pointed out a couple of cards that were maybe intended for a format like Commander, but then when you increase the fixing, for example, maybe they become a little bit more viable. So that wasn't something I was looking to eliminate necessarily, but just something I was trying to identify and then just keep an eye on based on how I tweaked the rest of those variables.
A lot of the Commander cards end up being very powerful in one-on-one contexts. Like Shorakai, for example, was a card that was printed for the Commander set, and you can see why it makes sense for Neon Dynasty Commander, but also one-on-one, it's just kind of a messed up Magic card. So, looking at the accompanying Commander product is another option for like broadening the card pool if you're designing a set-specific cube. I also want to emphasize that I think a lot of people probably are in it for flavor reasons. So, trying to combine Neon Dynasty with original Kamigawa, and we referenced you in this cube on the show before in saying that that's kind of a difficult challenge just because of how card development has changed so much in the intervening 17 years, however long it's been since they printed original Kamigawa. But I was even thinking, if you wanted to, you could combine Neon Dynasty with, Kaladesh, right? That's also a set that has an Artifacts Matter theme. It has a Vehicles theme. It's got a lot similar themes already that kind of combine and maybe complement each other. So you could just, combine it with anything else you wanted to based on any of your own design directions.
Yeah, so as of this moment, the cube includes cards from Neon Dynasty, original Kamigawa, and then some on-flavor cards. For example, some of the ninjas from Modern Horizons, I believe it was. So shout out again to the Multiverse Project. That was a great resource that I used when putting this list together. And my current goal with it is to offer just a kind of a powered-up retail draft experience, with games being relatively fast and close, although I'm fine with the occasional victory due to a well-timed Hidetsugu second right or an assembled Mech Titan, which I was on the end of in one of our drafts. So, I'm hoping that players will be able to draft these synergistic decks, and this is kind of another reason why I was intrigued or interested in this project was that my main cube is sort of trending towards higher power level and reliant less on synergy, and I like the idea of having an environment that's a little lower power level and a little more synergy dependent. It is non-singleton, so I didn't adhere strictly to those ratios that I mentioned earlier, but I did include multiple copies of some of the signpost uncommons that signal the themes, as well as some of the kind of bread and butter commons and uncommons in the set.
I think it makes a big difference, too. I mean, I think drafting this cube feels great, and part of it is that, yeah, if you're playing the blue-white deck, to really drive that vehicles theme home, having multiple Prodigies prototypes or whatever makes a really big difference.
The cube also breaks the singleton restriction for fixing, and that was probably the area that I changed the most from the baseline draft set, where I actually did do the math on the fixing density, and I think it was like 4% of the base set, and so I increased
That even sounds kind of high.
Yeah, I'm surprised by that.
It might have been, at least when I broke down by the card ratios, when I did the kind of 3 of each common, uncommon.
Sure.
Yeah. But right now in my cube, the fixing is a little over 10% of the total cube. It's a 540 card cube, 55 fixing lands. And I actually got a lot of good feedback on that after our first couple drafts, which was that most of the players felt like they could get the fixing they wanted. It made the decks feel pretty smooth. I think some of the kind of current issues and, possible future directions I want to take it. One kind of consideration I'm keeping in mind for the future is both removal density and quality. And I'm actually curious to hear your guys' thoughts on this, because my first thought was, well, I want to keep some of these cool powerful cards, some of the cool commander cards, and that would mean I probably want to increase both the quality and the density of removal. But then I was kind of wondering, well, will that just make the really fun, synergistic bread and butter commons and uncommons a little bit worse?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a difficult tension between synergistic effects and removal, because it kind of cuts both ways, that it makes your removal matter a lot more when there are synergistic components, such that removing one kind of has the effect of taking away multiple cards. If you have 2 cards that add up to more than the sum of their parts and you remove one, you're kind of removing both. So it's kind of like makes the removal fun and makes like using your removal fun, I think, when there are really synergistic sort of packages of cards. On the other hand, it makes the synergy worse. So it's like finding a balance where it's like, do players just have a lot of agency and feel like they are in control and having fun about how they are either leveraging those synergistic cards or leveraging their removal against it?
It's funny, I think that actually the density or quality are like totally separate questions when it comes to that issue. So for example, in the games we played on stream, Anthony, you and I, you had a couple of creatures in your deck like Goro Goro, whatever his epithet is, and Kami of Celebration, 2 creatures which have lots of value that is not at all related to them attacking and blocking. They just need to be in play and it works. And my only removal happened to be Intercessor's Arrest. And so I just kind of lost both those cards because I had no way to actually remove them.
Not to get too specific, that does deal with activated abilities, though, didn't it?
Yeah, that would deal with Goro Goro, I guess.
Not the important part.
Sure. So that's kind of a quality question, right? And I think that those are the sorts of things like, occasionally having a Goro Goro or a Kami of Celebration, something that has a really powerful bomby effect, which I think it's fun to include those. It also is much closer to retail limited to have some cards that are a lot more powerful than the other cards. It makes for exciting draft picks and getting real excited when you open a pack. So I think it makes sense to include those. I think the power level of those is often going to be kind of related to like the quality of removal. The question of quantity really affects how I play in the kind of deck I draft. So for example, in like retail sealed, my attitude towards removal is like, I'm only going to remove something if I literally can't beat it, right? It is very rare in retail sealed that I feel like I'm going to remove something as a like tempo advantage. Like I normally wouldn't want to spend my, murder on their 2-drop, but I think if I just kill their 2-drop, I can get them dead immediately. Usually you can't to deck that is fast enough, consistent enough that you're able to do that. And so the removal spells in your deck basically, in my mind, are kind of like perfect counterbalances to whatever bombs my opponent have. It's like, I'm going to save these for like the targets that really matter. And I think you can have a draft environment that plays similarly, where you don't have a huge density of removal, but the quality is good. So when you need to use it, you can actually remove the thing. It's actually gone. It's not coming back. It's not like it's a, upgraded bounce spell. And this is where we get into those interesting questions about like different card evaluations on removal. A card that's been semi-contentious we talked about in the show recently is Soul Partition, which is a card I'm still pretty excited about for my own cube, but other players are like, this is awful, who would ever want to play this? And I think it comes down to whether your cube is more like retail sealed or more like my cube, which is extremely low curving, and most removal I would say is being used as a tempo advantage. It's like, I'm going to get you dead because I'm going to remove that thing, which is all you've done your mana so far.
Well, I think it's interesting. There is kind of like another level of the metagame that develops from that, because if we're playing a match and I know that you have the removal that answers all my bombs and maybe I don't have removal that answers yours, suddenly that might put me in a position where I'm going to change my strategy game 2 and I'm going to try and start using my removal in more of a tempo way because I know that I can't win the long game.
Can you really know that, though? Because I think in retail sealed, it does often comes down to
you can when you get through literally your entire deck.
Okay, we knew after game 3 of our match because it went super long, and I. Spoiler alert for Anthony and my match that we played of Aaron's Kamigawa Remastered Cube on the stream that is now also on YouTube. If you want to watch that match and you don't want to know the outcome, skip the next 15-30 seconds of this podcast episode. I had a Cloudsteel Kirin in my deck, and my strategy, from the early turns of the game, it was clear that you were on target to win, Anthony. You were like pulling ahead on resources, pulling ahead in every single way, and I had this Cloudsteel Kirin in my hand, and I was like, my only plan here is just to play as much as I can, to keep up as much as possible, try and force you to use your removal to try and kill me, and then hopefully by the time I was forced to play and reconfigure my Cloudsteel Kirin in the same turn, you would be out of removal. And as it turned out, you had one left in your deck, and it took you a few turns to find it, but then you eventually did win the game. Spoiler alert, I guess, for the games if you're going to watch them online.
Spoiler alert after the spoiler.
Doesn't
work.
I'll edit in a spoiler before it. People
Great.
will love it. In that case, you did actually know, but rarely can you. I mean, sometimes you can tell, okay, my opponent's playing Grixis, right? Or they're playing black-red. I expect them to have more removal than a green-blue deck or something. You can get like rough sense of things like that, but I think rarely do you know, like, oh, I have more bombs than you have removal. I will win the inevitability, like, flip your deck over game.
I mean, there's always a big degree of just intuition, which I think is what makes a lot of games of Magic fun.
Anyway, all's a roundabout way of saying, I think there is a way to tune the removal so that you allow synergistic commons and uncommons to be playable, and also allow these, like, more bomby, like, mythic rares or rares to be playable, but not totally take over the environment, where it's just whoever had the luck of drafting more of those cards ends up winning. It's just a question of, I think, getting the like quality and density right, and I don't think it's just add more and that will fix it, because once you add a lot, then yeah, of course I'm going to remove your like 2-piece synergy thing because I've got tons of removal, so I might as well get rid of your like little synergy engine.
Right, and one thing I noticed when I did go back and look at the removal and try to categorize the kind of hard removal, conditional removal spells, I did notice that a lot of the kind of hard removal removes any target unconditionally. Spells were pretty expensive, and a lot of them couldn't be played at instant speed. Twisted Embrace is a good example. That's the 4-mana black enchantment where it has to actually enchant a creature to destroy another creature, and so if your creature gets killed or something happens, you're out of your removal spell. So, maybe just this, and this is another consideration I have for the cube, which is maybe going beyond Kamigawa and Kamigawa themed cards one day, and I think a good candidate would maybe be just adding in a couple of murders or Hero's Downfall or something like that in place of maybe a couple
something
of,
very generic where it doesn't like clash with the Kamigawa theme or flavor, but does sort of answer that question. I wonder how stupid is this idea? What if you just went through the cube list and like categorized every card that you considered to be like a power outlier bomb that demanded an answer, like a big Baneslayer or whatever, and then just made sure you had exactly that same number or very similar to that same number of hard removal spells?
I'm skeptical about this as just a thing to throw out there.
What's the flaw in that thinking? I mean, obviously
know.
different decks are going to end up with different densities of it, right? Like, so if you do that exercise, and let's say the bombs are evenly spread out between all the colors, but then you put all of your hard removal in black, then yes, sure, that's not going to work, because now the black deck's going to have a ton of removal, every other deck's going to have very little, and that's going to be sort of a balancing problem. But overall, I think it's just the kind of thing that cube design really lends itself to, because your players have agency. They get to draft things at whatever amount they value them. And if you get to the end of the draft and they say, hey, I don't have removal for these bombs, you could objectively say, hey, there is as many bombs as there are removal. Like, so if you didn't draft it, you didn't draft it. I don't know. I think it could be something too, like that is at least a starting point of if you want to make sure there's answers for those bombs, like check the numbers.
Sure.
And this all could be moot if you do anything like pack collation, because it was just occurring to me that a lot of people will, or at least the few that I found online as I was doing some research for this project, some people will sort out all the commons, all the uncommons, and all the rares after each draft. And then before each draft, they'll actually construct those packs using the proper number of commons, uncommons, and rares.
Which, if you're doing that, I mean, bless
Yeah.
you. That's so much work. I mean, it's a great if you're trying to mimic that limited retail experience, and your playgroup is lucky to have you, but miss me with that. I will never be collating packs like that for any of my cubes.
So, it was occurring to me that, well, if most of your removal is at common and uncommon, you're just going to naturally get a higher density if
Yep.
you're doing that and then having, kind of one bomb. I am not doing that. I should have maybe said that at the outset, but part of the reason why I wanted to just increase the density of mana fixing and then why I'm considering this removal question is I don't want to spend the energy to collect packs. Like Andy said, I think that's great. I just like being able to shuffle the whole pile together and deal it out. So that could be one way to get around this is if you do just keep the ratios similar and then your removal is at a lower rarity.
Sure.
One other thought. I think the quality does really matter there, too. Like, again, take that hypothetical starting point I gave. Let's say you go through the list and you're like, I have 40 bombs, 40 cards that are like a notch or two better than the average card in the cube. Then saying you have 40 removal spells, that's all well and good. If those are 6-mana removal spells, they're like D-level spells on rate, then they're not going to see play. And guess what is going to see play almost every draft? All of the bombs. People are going to take them highly.
Right, yeah.
It's going to pull them into colors. Those cards are much more likely to make decks. So that's also a quality question, right? Maybe it's making sure you have 40 quality removal spells that you think are very likely to make decks most of the time, because that means that you're going to have in the actual resulting main decks of your players, again, roughly an equal number of answers and big threats.
Sort of a counterpoint to that, though, something that I do really enjoy about this environment is that a lot of the removal is somewhat conditional or fits into part of the synergy. So you mentioned Twisted Embrace. You have these black-white decks that care about having enchantments, so that feels very cool. Also in black, you have things like the Life of Toshiro Umezawa, which just shrinks creatures. I really enjoy that kind of gameplay where it's like, well, do I attack first and maybe sacrifice a creature, potentially, depending on how my opponent blocks, in order to turn this card into a removal spell? In the deck that I drafted, I had Volt Charge, which scales up to deal 4 damage if you can sacrifice an artifact, which just fit really cleanly into my deck, but, forced me to make decisions about when I was using it and if it would scale differently in the game. So I really do like that kind of like more synergistic, conditional, situational removal for that. So maybe that's something to consider if you did want to just sort of like power it up. You are potentially also taking away some of those kind of gameplay moments.
I don't think those are necessarily mutually exclusive, right? Like, I don't think you should look at your list and say, well, I've got the Life of Toshiro Umezawa. That answers a bomb. Because I think objectively, most of the time it doesn't, right? Your opponent has a 5/5 flyer.
Yeah.
It doesn't really do anything to have the Life of Toshiro Umezawa. But that doesn't mean that you can't have your 30 or 40 hard answers to your 5/5 flyers, and also then however many additional synergistic removal pieces you could want to include.
For sure, yeah. Or another example is, the ninjas that get to destroy creatures when they deal combat damage. I mean, that's kind of like the extreme of really synergistic kind of removal.
That I think is closer to actual hard removal for me, though, at least.
True, definitely closer to hard removal, but it asks you to build your deck in a certain way to make it work.
Yeah, that's true.
And then I think the last big thing to note about this environment is, like I said, it was a really fun nostalgia trip for me to look back at some of the original Kamigawa cards, because that was the first set that I collected a lot of when I first started playing Magic. So my cousin and I, shout out Thomas if you're listening.
Yo, what up, Thomas? Thanks for tuning in.
We just played a ton of kitchen table decks, and Kamigawa and the original Ravnica were the first 2 sets that I kind of collected a lot of. And so it was really fun to go and look back at those cards. Sadly, I think a lot of them are going to be on the chopping block.
I felt so bad about it too, because like I drafted this cool blue-white ninja deck. I called it blue-white robot ninjas because I also had some things that cared about artifacts and artifact creatures. And I had 4 Kamigawa Bushido cards, and the Bushido mechanic plays really interestingly with ninjas, right? Because you don't want to block the Bushido creatures, because generally when they get blocked, they are way under rate, right? Because the power and toughness plus the Bushido value is like a powerful creature for the mana costs. So generally they're worse cards if you just let your opponent hit you with them. But of course that opens them up to being ninjutsu'd. But I looked at my list and tried to make cuts, and I was like, well, actually, you know what should be cut? All of these Moth Rider whatevers and this devout whatever dude, these little guys that just have Bushido are actually nowhere near Network Disruptor. Network Disruptor is just such a better card for that same role.
I didn't do a lot of digital testing. I just ordered the cards. Most of them were pretty cheap, and I just proxied all the expensive ones and then just brought it to a cube night. And so I snuck in some cards, like I'm looking at Inner Chamber Guard right here, which is a 1 and a white for a 0/2 human samurai with Bushido 2. And
not great.
And I was curious if I feel like we have a lot of really experienced players in our play group, a lot of really good players. And so I was wondering, I snuck some of those cards in just to see if anyone could or would make anything of them. And the answer for the most part was no. So I think, for example, if I'm looking for candidates to, again, if I want to cut a card and add in a murder, I think those kinds of cards are going to be the first candidates.
I'm interested actually to hear about what your methodology is going to be to making cuts, because there's a lot of ways to go about it. I think the average cube designer's intuition, or someone maybe that's new to cube design, will just want to cut the quote-unquote bad cards, like the cards that no one played in their main deck. It's like, well, get those out of here, replace them with stuff people will play in their main deck.
Yeah, which from that angle makes perfect sense. It's like, these cards already were not being played, they're not meaningful, so let's, replace with something that potentially is going to be.
But at the same time, what you're going to do then is, let's say you replace it with cards that are meaningful. Now you just have a new set of cards that are in the sideboard, and it's like, do you cut those? The other thing you can do, of course, is like cut from the top, or you could cut. How are you thinking you're going to manage your actual cuts?
Yeah, good question. So I think I am, especially we've only done a couple drafts. There are a handful of cards that immediately present themselves as good candidates to be cut. Kappa Cannoneer was a good example after our first draft.
That's cut from the top.
That was a cut from the top. That was just a ridiculous card that even the player playing it in his pool was like, yeah, I didn't really feel great about winning with this.
That's one of the best signs I think you can get from your players when they're like, I won with this card, and I think you should cut it. It's like, okay, well, that's the people that lose are always going to say that. The people that lose love to say you should cut the cards they lost to, but the inverse only really happens when it's kind of a big outlier.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have the inner chamber guards of the cube, which no one comments on, but I've just seen don't make it into anyone's pool if they have those types of cards. So right now, I am in the, I guess, somewhat fortunate stage of having some low-hanging fruit like that I can swap in and out. And my kind of, I guess, I don't know if you want to call it a conservative approach to making cuts, is just to add in some more copies of cards that aren't super powerful, but that I know players will draft. So for example, if I want to add in another white 2-mana creature, I would just probably add in another Spirited Companion and just go up to 4.
Wow.
It's an
There's
enchantment, draws a card. Exactly. So I have a stack of, when I was loosely following the rarity ratios when building this, I had a stack of commons and uncommons that didn't quite make it in. So I already actually have some changes lined up where I'm just going to make similar swaps following the color and mana curve. Beyond that, I think one thing that I want to do is turn an eye towards balancing the archetypes. So going back to what I said at the beginning about how the red-white samurai theme in the retail limited set didn't really come together. And I listened to a great podcast that Parker of Lucky Paper Radio referred me to, a podcast by Sam Black. It's called Drafting Archetypes, I believe. And his advice was basically make it a red-white control deck. So you draft a bunch of burn spells and then a bunch of Imperial Oaths, which is the card that makes 3 samurai tokens, and that sounded cool. So I kept
Boros, baby.
So I kept in a few of the attacking alone matters samurai cards, and as Anthony saw, some of them came in handy in other contexts when you have cards that care about attacking. But I didn't want to make that the central archetype. So another, for example, I think based on the commander cards, the kind of vehicles archetype, if you can get it to come together, is really potent. Whereas the ninjas archetype is, a lot of the signpost cards came from the regular Neon Dynasty draft set, and so in comparison aren't quite as potent. And so I think going forward, I'm going to be looking at the different archetypes and just trying to make sure that when a player drafts, goes all in on that archetype, they at least have a playable deck, even if they're maybe, they're switching halfway through the draft because their original color wasn't open or something like that.
Yeah. I think fundamentally the question you should ask about those cards you might cut from the bottom is, are those the cards you want to be good, right? And it might be that you attempted to design a cube where you really wanted Chamber Guard or whatever you said, the card that basically has Defender, it's a Bushido card with 0 power. If that's the card you really wanted to play with, that's the card you wanted to make good, I don't think it would be a good strategy to, after a couple drafts, be like, well, no one's playing this, I guess I have to cut it. That's where you should really be looking to cut from the top to then make those cards that you care about playable. But in this case, I mean, the cube is really fun. I got to say, I'm really impressed with the cube. It was really fun to play and draft. I think the decks that came together were really cool. So I would say the first couple of drafts were like a roaring success. And so in that context, I do think it makes sense to say, okay, well, we like this. This is good. So what's not contributing to the experience? And that's whatever people aren't drafting and playing. And then how can you use those slots more profitably to maybe patch some holes or tweak some things where you need to?
Sure. Yeah, I wonder if you could use that sort of same thought process of like cutting from the top or bottom, not just to individual cards, but to themes as a whole. I think that it's totally makes a lot of sense to say this theme wasn't really fun, wasn't really powerful, so let's just cut it. I think you could also say like this didn't really work in the limited environment, but let's throw in a couple things that care about attacking alone or just attacking or make attacking easier and just kind of power that theme up a little bit could also be a way to approach that.
Yeah, I think one of the great virtues of working on a cube that is not power maxed and also working on a cube where you break singleton is like, if you want to make the Jitsu better, just put in a couple more Ninja of the Deep Hours and a couple more Changeling Outcasts. You might even not even have Changeling Outcasts right now, but that card is messed up in the Ninja archetype. It's pretty easy to say these are like bread and butter commons that just like power up this archetype, which is nice for you to have that control as a designer to just say, yeah, let's power this up by putting in more of the good cards.
Yeah, I also think with my other cube, which like I said is trending a little higher power, that's just my cube where I get a cool card, at a pre-release or something and just throw it in and kind of see what happens.
Yeah, that's what's up.
With this cube, I think I'm going to be a little more conservative just because, you guys have talked on the show before about, small sample sizes with drafting, players' predilections. There's a whole host of reasons why you can't get, statistically relevant data on cards that you should cut or add depending on what your goals are. So what I'm probably going to do is just, keep a list of cards in the back of my mind, like Changeling Outcast, that I want to try, and then maybe introduce only a couple of them between drafts and just see how that goes. And then, so I think the growth of and evolution of this cube will be a little bit slower, but, hopefully just as successful. A couple of my considerations with this cube, which are probably going to be specific to your playgroup, but just as just food for thought out there, especially if you're someone who's thinking, is this a good way for me to get into cube, is one thing that I considered is if your playgroup is really experienced and really enfranchised, like I got kind of back into Magic in 2020 after a really long break, and I had done maybe a couple of drafts before showing up last year to start playing with you guys. And so when I was thinking about, well, what can I bring to this really, I want to make a cube, but what can I bring to this really enfranchised playgroup who is used to playing with really fun, powerful, balanced environments? I think a set cube of a set that everyone likes is a really great way to bring something new to the group that everyone's excited about. So I think those are some of the pros if you're thinking about this as an entry point into cube.
One other thing I do want to talk a little bit more about, we talked about the Commander cards, so specifically talking about the cards from the Commander sets that were associated with the main set.
Which if you're doing a recent set, all sets now have their corresponding Commander products. So if you're building a recent set cube, which is more likely than an old set cube, if you're listening to this, you probably drafted a set recently you liked, then you do have a bigger card pool available to you.
Yeah, and I think those actually played particularly interestingly in this environment, because there's definitely a trend that a lot of the cards that are designed for Commander are just super, super powerful when you put them in a 1v1 environment. But I think there's been another trend in the design of cards for Commander over maybe the last 2 or 3 years, which is that a lot of them are getting more and more sort of narrow or specific in a way that I think is actually positive. So I was looking at, for example, some of these cards during the draft. I opened up a Chishiro, the Shattered Blade, and it basically is a 4-mana 4/4, so I'm just like, yep, it's a Commander card. It's going to have great stats for 1v1, basically always these days, but also
when you realize Magus of the Moon is a 3-mana 3/3.
Exactly. It's like, wow, okay, very cool. But it says whenever you cast whenever an aura and equipment enters the battlefield under your control, you make a 2/2 spirit token, and it has additional abilities as well, but it really is a high build around. Like, you need to put a bunch of aura and equipment to really get paid off for it. So that's something that really stood out to me with a lot of those new Commander cards, is that they are less just total powerhouses and more things that kind of push your draft in a different way. And I liked that in this context, they weren't all entirely just, this is the icon for this 2-color pair. It was like, this is a little bit adjacent to it, but still you're going to want to try and build your deck around it a little bit differently, which I think just adds some really nice texture to the way that you're drafting your decks.
It's also, I think, for people that really like drafting a specific limited set, it's very exciting to open what is essentially that limited set, but now you have Shorikai. It's like, It's very cool to enhance it in that way if your playgroup is familiar with the base material. Having entirely on flavor, new exciting cards you can put in there is a really great way to inject some variety and fun, I think.
Totally.
I will say, Commander cards do tend to be significantly more complicated, and I think you should be conscious of that. A lot of these cards have a lot of text, and maybe they don't even have that much text, but the way the text works is kind of a little bit obtuse and can be confusing. So something to keep in mind, maybe. But you'll know from looking at the specific cards you're interested in whether or not the complexity is a problem or not.
I think something else that really makes them work here, though, is the fact that we are in a context where a lot of the cards don't have the complexity. There are a lot of cards in this set that just have a keyword or, one or two effects, one or two lines of rules text. And I think you sort of get to put your complexity points wherever you want. And the fact that you're going to see 2 or 3 of these like really complex, powerful cards in the draft rather than every single one being from that kind of space.
You can ask your players to read 1 or 2 cards in the pack. Asking them to read the 7 they've never seen before, they're probably just going to take the lightning bolt or whatever.
And I think that actually is going to make players more likely to actually read them in the first place than put them in your deck. I feel like very often players fall into this sort of familiarity bias, and they just end up picking the cards they know and are familiar with and putting them in their deck. But when I have seen, okay, here's another duplicate of this removal spell I'm familiar with, I can process this pack pretty quickly, let me take the time to read this card, and maybe I'll actually, decide to build around it.
Another thought that you sparked, Anthony, with that was when I was working on this cube, I wasn't just paying attention to the mana fixing, but also the mana curve of the environment. And I think when I was looking at the general mana curve of Neon Dynasty, and I imagine this is true of most retail limited sets, the curve is pretty high. There aren't a lot of as many 1 mana creatures, for example, in most colors. And so it seems to me that I've had some success with our playgroup by just cutting completely cards that maybe seem sweet, but they cost 5 or 6 mana, and just adding in multiple copies of the lower mana spells. And I think that, people have fun casting their spells. No one likes to draw a hand that's a bunch of 4 or 5 mana cards. And so I think that's another...
Some people do like it. They're sickos, but they're out there.
Casting expensive spells?
Specifically drawing a hand with all expensive spells. Daniel will often turn to me in a draft and be like, look at my perfect hand. And it's 3 lands, 2 4-drops, a 5-drop, and some like...
Look at this curve. It starts at 4, but wow, is it consistent past that?
And I, of course, will roll my eyes and be like, oh, Daniel, and then look over and he's winning 2 turns later. It's like, okay, well,
amazing.
Off he goes.
Yeah, I think that strategy makes a lot of sense. People do like to cast their spells, and I think it really makes a lot of sense when you combine it with upping the fixing. Just like increasing the tempo of the format a little bit, increasing the fixing density, and reducing the overall cost. All of that just hangs really well for me.
So if you're looking for some resources to build a set cube, some that I found particularly helpful were, first of all, a great Channel Fireball article by Jason Waddell. It's called Cube Design Set Cubes. I felt like that article really had everything that you would need if you were just going to sit down. You were familiar with draft and maybe familiar with cube, but you didn't know anything past that. I think that article is just a great one-stop shop.
Jason, friend of the show. Shout out to Jason.
Beyond that, I actually did a lot of research into the retail limited environment of the set. So in my case, Neon Dynasty. So I was using retail draft review sites like DraftSim and MTGA Zone, just reading articles about what the players who were drafting that limited set thought was working well. I also wanted to shout out a couple of Lucky Paper radio episodes. So the hosts aren't great, but they put out good content.
Wow, this is when you choose to tell us.
But no, the bread and butter episode, the texture of removal, and then the 3 Neon Dynasty episodes that you guys did were pretty helpful as well. I would also just say, for general cube resources, I also would recommend the logistics episode, which I went back and looked as number 60, and then your resource guide episode, which is number 105, as a good place for cubers to start who are just looking for general content advice. And then finally, the cube map. I thought it was really cool. I went on to, because of the content of the cubes, set cubes have their own little clusters. So there's like an Innistrad cluster, and Neon Dynasty and Kamigawa cluster. And so that was really helpful to just click around and see what other themed cubes had in them, what their philosophies were, and so on.
Yeah, I think the cube map actually does a really great job of sort of separating out these different types and approaches to set cubes. Very often you'll see, here's the Innistrad section, and there's, very clearly different sections for set cubes, like the most rigorous, what do you call it? The most just trying to recreate. Most faithful recreations of those limited environment type cubes. And then you'll see in separate sort of like, really you'll just sort of see that spectrum in some cases of the things that are a little bit more flexible, the things that are a little bit more curated, the cubes that start to integrate more cards that are from the plane, and then things that are just, loosely inspired but much more curated to whatever the designer's taste is.
I'll add a couple things to that resource list too. If you are working on a set cube, you can always refer to 17 lands if the set is on Arena for the performance of the individual cards in that set in retail draft. That's the most rigorous data set you're going to get there in terms of what is and is not working in the draft set. I'd particularly recommend maybe looking at the Signpost Gold uncommons for each of the color pairs and see how those perform. That gives you a very good, I think, barometer for how good that particular archetype or color pair is in that particular set. One other tool which I've used occasionally is there's an AsFan calculator online. It's on yeefbear.com, yeefbear.com/as-fan. And this will allow you to either select a set that exists and show you the AsFan for a bunch of different mechanics in that set. So, for example, it's got a page for Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, and you can see the AsFan for Ninjutsu channel where you configure artifacts matter, blah, 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 all the way down, including, like, you know, the faux exalted and stuff. That's also a good way to then compare those numbers to the AsFan in your own cube, because that same page has a calculator where you can just enter custom values for stuff in your own environment. So if you are trying to make sure that your support for ninjutsu is identical to or slightly more than what you experienced in Retail Limited, that's the best way to do it. It's hard to calculate that stuff otherwise because the packs are collated, right? So if you go on Scryfall, you look for all the cards with ninjutsu in a given set, you then have to multiply by this factor of how many commons and uncommons there are. For stuff like mana fixing, it can be weird because sometimes packs are collated differently with mana fixing. So I like that site a lot for just getting turning the experience you had drafting it into some objective number-based thing you can look at as a reference point, so you then have something to compare to.
Yeah, I know, for example, with the retail Neon Dynasty drafts, I believe you were guaranteed a Saga enchantment in every pack. And again, that's not something a rule I'm following here, but I did go through and just kind of get a sense of, okay, how many Sagas and just enchantments in general that trigger those enchantments matter themes do I have? And I felt like I had a high enough density for the enchantment deck. Seems to be working so far.
Yeah, even when you're not collating a pack, that's the kind of thing where you can say, okay, well, everyone was guaranteed one. The actual AsFan was probably a little bit higher than one because there were also ones that other rarities. You could get a foil one. I'm not sure how it all worked. Maybe was it exactly one? I don't remember.
I think it was exactly one. I think
there's no way to get any other sagas at any other slots in the pack. It was always just one in the saga pack or a saga slot.
I believe that's correct. I think they try and keep the rarities still pretty consistent. So if you have comments, they'll have common sagas still appear at the common rate, more or less. So I don't know if it really has a huge impact. I think a bigger question when they're actually just building booster packs is they want to make sure that if somebody's opening one booster pack, they see a saga for sure, so they get that theme of the set, same with like Legends and Dominaria, which is another thing just to be aware of. Think about why Wizards is building sets and packs in certain ways, because some of those things just aren't going to apply to you because you're not building packs that a random person's going to open one booster pack of. You're trying to design, the best draft experience. So a lot of those things you can definitely afford to give up on.
My point is, though, even if you're not doing pack correlation, if you did want to, say, for example, mirror the density of sagas in your cube that you experience in Retail Limited, you could make the average AsFan the same, and it's not going to, of course, break down exactly evenly. Some people are going to have 2, some people are going to have 0 sometimes. But still, get the same number of sagas roughly going around the table in each draft, which will make it pretty similar to Retail Limited. So, a good look there. I want to just, summarize our, then, tips for people that want to make their own set cube. The first one for me is just don't overthink it. I really do think that just doing a draft that you thought was fun, putting all those cards in the same sleeves and sleeving up some basic lands, that is a perfectly valid cube. You will have fun drafting that again. I promise you, it will still be fun.
Yeah, I think that's a great tip. I mean, I will play my role here and say you can use spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are great. You can, go on Scryfall, do a search for, specifically you can search for the set and add the is booster tag to get exactly what you'll actually open in a pack. And then, break that down by each color or each rarity and see how many cards there are, plug those into a spreadsheet, and you can figure out all the numbers if you want. I think if you love spreadsheets, you will enjoy that. But I
don't think we have to tell people that they can get more complicated and overwrought with it if they want to. People are definitely keen to do that.
I think people should know that spreadsheets are an option.
If you're starting with the spectrum of do you want to precisely replicate the retail draft versus just capture the essence, I think, like Andy said, just sleeving the booster box that you drafted up and drafting again, it's going to be a great time. If you do decide to go further, when you're thinking about, rarity ratios, pack collation, mana fixing, kind of smoothing those peaks and valleys of power level, there are so many different directions that you can take it, but I think this is a really great way to just get your first cube. Like I said at the beginning, this is the way that I wish I had gotten into cube, and now that I have one, it's been a really fun and flavorful design experience.
Yeah, I think the way maybe to summarize that is just like if you do get to the point where you're making cuts and you're like crafting the environment instead of just either faithfully representing a total limited environment or just leaving up a box, follow the fun with all your cuts. Don't worry about cutting from the bottom, cutting from the top, or any of these balances or graphs. Like if a card is fun, leave it. If a card is not fun, cut it and put it in a card that you think will be fun. That's a really good way to just make sure the cube stays exciting and fun to draft. I do think the next level is thinking about all the considerations that Wizards has that you two both alluded to when they make a booster pack, and how many of those considerations are not valid when you're just building a limited set to be drafted, right? I mean, they're trying to print specific densities of cards for certain constructed formats to make sure they get into circulation. They're trying to make sure they have the right number of build-arounds for people that love doing certain build-around things. They're trying to make sure that someone that opens a pack doesn't see 4 lands, because that's not fun for people that are new to Magic, that don't think lands are fun. They don't want to see 4 lands in their pack. They're going to feel like they got ripped off.
I mean, they're trying to include strategic reprints to both make the set exciting and valuable, and also just, do call-outs that players are going to enjoy, which, in a different way might be a factor you'd consider, but not necessarily to the same point.
So I think thinking about that broadly is the best way to mentally approach the improvement of your cube over time. And what that really will come down to most of the time, I think, is, like you said, Aaron, you're going to want more fixing than you have in Retail Limited. I wrote an article about the density of fixing in cubes and all the considerations that go into it, and TLDR, I think you should have a lot more fixing than you have in Retail Limited, and I think it's entirely possible to have a really fixing dense environment that still encourages just 2 or 1 color decks and doesn't devolve into 3, 4, and 5 color decks very often. So I would say more fixing, lower curve. I think curve is the thing where we see a lot of times cards getting printed, like for Commander, for example, where cards curve a lot higher. People want to see exciting big cards, like people that are not that enfranchised, that just open a pack because they think Magic is cool. They want a big creature in there. Big creatures are cool. That might not be what you want in your cube draft environment. So
but it also might be. Big creatures are actually cool.
It's true. But so I think very often it'll be more fixing, lowering the curve, and just focusing on the stuff you think is fun.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've alluded to it a couple times, but I would also just recommend Mark Rosewater's Drive to Work podcast, where he talks about the design of Magic. I think it obviously applies to all of the episodes that we do talking about cube design and, it being a facet of, or sort of a microcosm, a small piece of game design. But I think it really does apply here because he's talking about the way that often they are, the things that they're considering when they put cards into a booster pack, the things that they think about when they're designing a limited set. So it really does give you a lot of insight into how you could sort of extend that process and customize it for yourself.
One last idea that I had was that if you get tired of replicating that retail draft experience, it's very easy and fun to up the power level, swap out some of the lower powered cards, and make it resemble a more traditional higher powered cube. My sense is that's a lot harder to go the other way and depower a powerful environment, especially one that maybe your playgroup has drafted. So I think if you come to your playgroup with a set cube and it's a new thing, it's fun. I'm glad to hear that you guys had fun with the first couple drafts. I had a lot of fun as well. And then, in the future, if I add in some non-Kamigawa cards that, are still powerful and fun, hopefully that's still going to be a fun experience for everyone. But that still allows for that evolution if you want to take it even further in a different direction.
Let's end on a pack one pick one from your Kamigawa Remastered Cube. I don't often do this, Anthony, but I overruled your pack that you generated at random. I think it was boring, and we're just taking Fabled Passage out of it. It didn't have any cool cards from the Commander set, didn't have any cool cards from original Kamigawa, so I've generated a new one here.
Yeah, you're correct. We would have just taken Fabled Passage.
Here, Fabled Passage is still an option, but I think there's a lot of other things that could potentially compete with it. So I'll read out this pack. If you want to follow along, we have a cards mentioned page for every single episode that shows you visually all the cards we talked about in chronological order. So towards the bottom of that page, you'll find this pack one pick one because we're at the end of the episode. The pack is Reality Heist, Kami of Celebration, Teachings of the Kirin, Malicious Malfunction, Norika Yamakaze the Poet, Behold the Unspeakable, Nizumi Prowler, Needle Verge Pathway, Iron Apprentice, The Restoration of Eganjo, Reinforced Ronin, Fabled Passage, Ninja of the Deep Hours, Assassin's Ink, and Ryu Storm's Edge. I think this is a very interesting pack, and as always, I'm going to make you give your response first, Anthony.
Wow,
we'll end on Aaron.
Great job making a better pack than I could by hitting the random button one time.
Why are you taking it personally? It's your fault for taking it personally. It's a random pack. What are you taking, Anthony?
I have to read some of the cards.
Oh, okay.
I agree that this is a much more interesting pack. Obviously, we do still have a Fabled Passage. We talk about fixing and how great it is to take this early. You know, Fabled Passage is 100% going to make my deck, which makes it really appealing. But we do have a couple cards that are kind of power outliers here. Ryu's Storm's Edge is exactly that kind of commander card. It's a creature that wants you to attack with Samurais and Warriors alone, and then really pays you off in a powerful way. So,
but also it's just a 4-mana 3/3 first strike, which is not
also
awful.
just pretty good. So, like, that's the kind of thing that I do kind of want to take early in order to build around. In the same way, Kami of Celebration just offers that kind of like very cool build around. It asks you to attack with modified creatures, but then if you are actually then able to do the thing it does for you, modifies more of your creatures. So I think it is powerful. It is fun to play with.
Card is good. Card is very strong.
Card is good. I'm also a little bit biased, obviously, just because I played Kami of Celebration in the draft. That, you know, it's important to be aware of your biases there. There's also, what is this called? Behold the Unspeakable. I'm looking at these cards from a little bit of a distance, so can't read them verbatim. I'm tempted to take Kami of Celebration here because it is a monocolored card. It has a really high ceiling, and if you can build around it, it's going to just generate a ton of value. But I'm also really tempted to take Fabled Passage. I think I went a little bit too long there. What are you taking?
There are 3 cards here that I think are power outlier status in this cube, and those cards are Kami of Celebration, the Restoration of Iganjo, and I'm throwing Ninja of Deep Hours in there, even over something like Ryu's Storm's Edge, which Ryu's good. I don't think it's good enough to pull me into a gold card, a gold 4-drop, specifically pack 1.
Oh yeah, Restoration's really good. I kind of skimmed over that.
So the question is, do I want to take one of these, I think, power outlier-y cards, or do I want to play it safe and start with a Fabled Passage? And my mood right now, I'm taking Restoration of Iganjo. This card is basically a saga that flips into a Brimaz eventually. So it's got a really, really good value in terms of what you get out of your 3-mana investment. Takes a little time to get that investment paid off, but I think in all but the fastest, most aggressive matchups, it's going to be a huge bomb. And it is a monocolored card, just white, so I'm pretty open to taking whatever comes my way in the next pack. Those are the only cards I would consider taking over Fabled Passage at all in this pack, though, I think. Aaron, what are you going to take?
Yeah, so I had my eye also on Fabled Passage, also on Restoration of Iganjo, also on Kami of Celebration, but then one that you guys didn't mention was actually Assassin's Ink. So this is it is double black to cast, but it does get cheaper if you have artifacts, and then cheaper again if you have enchantments. And it's just destroy target creature, planeswalker. Like we mentioned earlier, the density and quality of removal is something I'm thinking about, and there aren't a ton of hard removal spells in here, so it just caught my eye as potentially a solid pick, even though, you know, you probably don't want to start off on a double pip casting cost for your first pack. I probably would be boring and take the Fabled Passage, but ruling the Fabled Passage out, I would probably be on Kami of Celebration as well.
A nice range of options there for that pack. I think you're right that maybe a hard removal spell should have jumped out more at us in this pack, because like you said, it's not super abundant here, and there are bombs. Your opponent is going to have their Kami of Celebration or whatever, and you need to be able to answer it. I do think there's an interesting question of, do you take the bomb or the thing that answers the bomb? And for me, early, I'm always going to take the proactive threat, because that card is always going to be good when I draw it, pretty much, as opposed to the answer only being good when my opponent specifically has a bomb for me to remove. But I will definitely prioritize hard removal pretty highly in this environment, I think, after I know what lane I'm in.
Yeah, I don't think I would take Assassin's Ink here first, but I did just want to call it out as one that deserves consideration, I think.
Well, Aaron, this is a very cool cube, and thank you for coming on and talking about it. Also, like, you are somebody that just started playing Cube, like, what, this past, like, a year ago, basically, pretty much, more or less?
Yeah, I think my first draft with you guys was around May of last year, so less than a year.
Like 9 months basically ago. Mm-hmm. And in that time, you've become a true bona fide Cube head. You're talking about maybe attending CubeCon next year, which we hope we can drag you to. It's always a delight to play with you, and I'm really excited to continue playing this cube for many years to come.
Yeah, thank you guys again so much for having me on. I have to say it's a little bit surreal because I got into Cube through a friend of mine. Shout out to Bryce down in Richmond, who's
what's up, Bryce? Thanks for listening.
And he's actually come up to a draft up here when we did a Cube night. But anyway, he kind of introduced me to the idea of Cube, and then I found the podcast even before I had moved to Baltimore and was listening to it, and then heard a reference to you guys being in Baltimore, emailed you, and here we are. So
you can put me on blast and tell people how long it took me to respond to your email. that way people don't feel bad, but I'm slow to respond to their emails too.
A measly 92 days, 12 hours, 36 minutes.
I'm sorry. I'm awful.
It's been a really great time. It's been a lot of fun coming on and talking about the Cube with you guys. And exactly what you said, Andy, here's to many more years of Cube drafts ahead.
Go forth, listeners. Make your own set cubes and get as invested in this beautiful format as Aaron is.
Yeah, I really hope, if there's anyone out there listening to this who's, like I said at the beginning, debated getting into Cube, but they weren't quite sure how, or maybe it was a little intimidating, or they just needed, that germ of an idea as a jumping off point. I hope this has, provided some help and some inspiration.
Yeah, I feel like we've done a couple episodes recently where we kind of implicitly gave the listeners homework, most recently talking about starting a local Cube group.
People took that challenge to heart.
Have really taken that challenge, and it's been so awesome to hear from, people commented on the Reddit or sent in emails, allegedly. Maybe they just got lost in the inbox.
I'm trying to get better about it, okay?
About how they've been starting, talking to their local game store owner, talking to, finding one or two other people in their local area that they might want to, be the seed to growing a Cube group, and that's so rewarding and satisfying to hear. And
the best.
I look forward to hearing, hopefully, a bunch of people say that they have not been, it's been a little bit too intimidated to get into Cube, but they just sleeved up a box and they're starting that way.
But then Aaron told him it was okay. Just take one draft's worth of cards, sleeve them up, and you can have a Cube. We got one amazing email anecdote, which I hope this turns out to be true, where somebody said they listened to the episode about getting the local playgroup more into Cube and trying to grow the group, and they were like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go down to my local game store and try to make it happen. And they apparently play there pretty often, and when they arrived that night, they saw some new people they'd never seen before that were there to do the exact same thing, also to try and get a Cube playgroup going. And they didn't ask them if they also listened to the episode of the show, but I like to think they did. And these two people were separately sitting alone in their homes in some other city, and they were like, I sure wish I could play Cube with somebody. And then they both came out on the same night, and a new connection was made. I like to think
beautiful
that's happened.
I think we should promote this happening even more. I think maybe next year, I don't know how ambitious we want to get, but we should
Secret handshake?
We should create that's also an interesting idea. I was just going to say pick a date and be like, this is the go to your LGS and play Cube night, and just meet new people.
Cube Day. Let's make Cube Day happen.
Every Cube's Day.
I think an annual Cube Day is a great idea.
All right.
We don't have the pull to make that happen, but we know the people collectively that have the pull to make this happen.
That's a really good point. Okay, yeah, we
just got to get J-Bro and John and everybody all invested in the same thing, and we can get Gwen to put a banner on Cube Cobra that leads up to it, tells you this is Cube Day, go to your LGS and play Cube.
Let us know your nominations for when do you think Cube Day should
be. Send in your date nominations for Cube Day. I guess 3-3, but the problem is there's not a third 3.
I want to be I would say err on the side of practical rather than flavorful, but that's just me.
I mean, being memorable is very practical.
I'm going to go with November 18th.
No, okay, I'm writing that down on the I'm going to open up a nominations list.
You just pick a random date. It's pretty far away.
It's my birthday. I just thought it'd be cool to have Cube Day on my birthday.
You're diluting your birthday, Aaron. You fool. You're supposed to make it all about you. That's what I'm talking about. A real martyr over here. All right, that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thanks for tuning in. Go forth, make your set cubes. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by Anthony and I, doing no real work and making Aaron do it all for us. Thanks for making the podcast, Aaron.
Oh, it was a lot of fun, guys. Thanks for having me.